right. Good evening and welcome to the fourth episode of Webster Speaks, Dialogues on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm your moderator, Earl McCoy Jr. We meet every other week on Wednesday, 7 p.m. Central Time to converse about issues connected to systematic racism, social justice, and working towards equity. Tonight, we are discussing how the media cover race. This show will be extended to accommodate our special guests and the multitude of topics we will cover tonight. Quick reminder, the Q&A and chat will be disabled during our live talk. However, we still want to hear your voice. If you want to participate and ask questions, please do so via Twitter using the hashtag Webster Speaks. We will get to as many questions as we can during tonight's conversation. And now I'll turn it over to our host, Webster's Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent C. Puellen.
Thanks, Earl. Good evening and welcome to Webster Speaks, Dialogues on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. This is our fourth episode, and I'm so glad that you all continue to join us and are joining us for the first time. 2020 has definitely been a year in which violence against African Americans and subsequent protests against the police killings of unarmed Black men have been dominating headlines. It has evoked racial awakening, reckoning, and to some degree, reimagining in both American society and in its news. Important questions have been raised. Have protests been done fairly? How has news coverage shaped public opinion about social justice? Are Black and brown voices being amplified accurately in both news and entertainment? How can we make a better future and not repeat the past? Tonight, we're going to discuss how the media cover race with two powerful figures in both local and national news. Carol Daniel, the voice of St. Louis and KMOX radio as a news anchor, and Eric Deggans, with National Public Radio, NPR, and he serves as their TV critic and author. Carol has been at KMOX since 1995 and is a three-term president of the Greater St. Louis Association of Black Journalists. She is also an award-winning columnist, motivational speaker, and author. She received 2 national newspaper awards for her column, Carol's Journal. She has also been honored by the Missouri Broadcasters Association, the YWCA, and Deluxe Magazine, among others. Eric Deggans is an award-winning journalist, pundit, and TV critic for National Public Radio. He is also the author of the nationally acclaimed book, Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous Words. There we are. To divide a nation.
Show your copy. Show your copy.
Show your copy. He's also a contributor to NBC and CNN's Reliable Sources. He serves as an adjunct instructor at Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you. So let's just kind of dive in this in terms of diversity in the newsroom. News certainly is a business. And why does diversity matter in the news business? And why is it that some people still just don't understand it?
It matters because point of view matters. And people don't understand it still because there is still resistance to change. And there is this ongoing sense among some that they are going to give up something in order to let others in the room. There is still criticism of the quote unquote affirmative action hire, this sense that maybe the minority that you hire is not as qualified as someone else and that we might be taking jobs from others. But point of view matters. And we bring a different point of view, both as African Americans and for myself as a Black woman. So point of view clearly matters. We have a historical reference point that maybe others don't have. So that's how I would answer that.
Yeah, I've often said that diversity is an important part of accuracy. It's not just about being fair to everybody in the newsroom and making sure that everyone has a shot at excelling and the best jobs and the best beats. It's you will not cover issues in your community accurately if you don't have the viewpoints and information from everyone in that community. And anyone who's consumed news, read a newspaper, or watched a local TV outlet can think of stories that they covered in their own community where they didn't get it right because they didn't have somebody from the community helping them figure out how to cover it. And so I always say that diversity is a journalism value that's connected to accuracy. And that's what makes it so important. And the reason they don't understand it, I think, is because for so long, American newspapers have had a vision of who their target audience is. And their target audience, unfortunately, is not us. It is middle class, middle-aged white people. And what has happened is that the urban centers where these newspapers are based, where the Journal-Constitution is based, or where the Washington Post is based, or the New York Times, or even the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, has gotten browner and blacker and more diverse, and their news rooms haven't kept pace, and so they're being forced to cover these stories and these issues, and they don't have the diversity in their newsroom to actually cover it, and so they're resisting the way in which their target audience has to shift. And of course, Carol said it very well. They're resisting giving up power.
One of the conversations we often talk about in DEI spaces is the idea that diversity matters in all of our spaces because it provides that difference in perspective, right? Not only in representation, but in perspective. In newsroom, just like in corporate spaces, educational spaces, it's top down, right? We need to push down that message of importance and upholding the importance of diversity and inclusion. So as we think about the newsrooms, and especially in management, what are some of those conversations that are taking place over the years in terms of trying to push for this representation and diversity of Carol, to your point, Blacks, people of color, but also women of color, right? And have strides actually been made?
Eric, jump on that.
Oh, okay. So I guess what I would say is what the conversation has been. I've always centered the conversation on being better at journalism. When I worked at the Tampa Bay Times newspaper, it was the biggest, it still is, the biggest newspaper in Florida. The biggest newspaper in Florida, right? So Florida is a state that we know has lots of Cuban immigrants. It has a lot of folks from Puerto Rico. It has the second largest population of Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico, second to New York City. We had something like 4 or 5 people on our staff who could speak Spanish out of a metro newspaper that was reaching 500,000 subscribers a day. I mean, it didn't make any sense at all. And so, of course, our coverage is going to be affected, right? You know, it's going to be harder to cover stories that are in Spanish-speaking communities if you only have 4 or 5 people who can speak the language in an editorial department that has 200 employees. So that's how I tried to make the case. I was president of the Tampa Bay Association of Black Journalists for 8 years, and I was constantly pressing the people who ran the local TV stations and the radio stations and the newspapers to hire more, because it would increase the effectiveness of the journalism. We would go into undercovered, underserved, underseen communities, and we would cover them well. When I started working at the Tampa Bay Times, not too long after I started working, we had a situation where a young Black man had taken his uncle's car without permission. His uncle reported it stolen. The police tried to stop him, and because the police officer chose to stand in front of his car, he was forced to shoot and kill the young man when the guy wouldn't stop the car and get out of the car. And, you know, the officer was found to have violated procedure, but he was never prosecuted for killing the guy. And it touched off riots in the black community in St. Petersburg, in part, I think, because the newspaper hadn't done a good job of covering those issues leading up to when that happened, and people had finally had enough when this young man was killed. So I was constantly trying to say, unless you want to have a whole bunch of other riots, we really have to cover this community better. And that only happens when you have a more diverse newsroom.
I would say in terms of the conversations that are being held with management, I've had more of those certainly in my position with the Greater St. Louis Association of Black Journalists than I have had as a news anchor and as a reporter. I've been with the current station, KMOX, for 25 years. And previous to that, prior to that, 2 other newsrooms in my career. And so in 2 of those newsrooms, I have been the only African-American anchor and reporter. At KMOX, we did have 2 other reporters when I first came who were women of color and who left shortly thereafter. But my conversations from the point of view of the Black journalists have been with other leadership in the community. Most news directors around the country are still white men. That is not to say that they cannot understand the need to diversify their newsroom. Some just don't believe it. They just don't think it's an issue. We are dealing right now with an NPR station in the St. Louis area who is facing serious charges of discrimination against an Asian reporter and Black female reporters and an anchor. And so those conversations we are about to have. And so the difficulty is that sometimes we're in a position, Eric and I, who have been in these leadership positions, where you don't know what is happening until it has happened. And then you're doing, I hate to use the term a cleanup job, but then we're coming in at a crisis point. And so what I would love to see, and this is me dreaming, is that people would simply understand, people in positions of authority would simply understand that this issue is not going away. The need for you to have a diverse newsroom is not going away. And so you need to educate yourself. If you don't know how, if you don't know what the deal is, educate yourself. Because if you don't, then we're coming in and a crisis has occurred. And that's not the way that it should be, but I'm prepared for that to be the way that it is, and to get into that situation, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I would, if I could just break it, I would say, like the good thing about this modern moment is that we can point to the way that the op-ed editor at the New York Times got ousted, and we can point to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the way the editor-in-chief there was forced to quit when they presented coverage that was unfair and borderline racist, and the staff rose up and said, we're not going to tolerate it anymore. So now you can go to other editors and you can say, do you want what happened at the Philadelphia Inquirer to happen in your newsroom? Do you want what happened to the New York Times op editor to happen to your op editor? And so finally there's a sense that you have a history, and you can say, if you don't get right on this issue, you will pay a price beyond Black people in the community being angry at you. You may lose your job, or someone, some valued employee who you trust may lose their job. So at least now we have some ammunition to come to these managers and say, you need to do this because your newsroom could be significantly disrupted if you don't take care of it.
So in many ways, I guess the newsroom has this opportunity also of viewing their audience as consumers. And shouldn't they, in fact, be trying to play to them?
It's an interesting point because I work at a news talk radio station. And statistically, the listeners of news talk radio are white men. What I have argued about in the past to previous administrations at my station is that don't men care about their daughters? Don't men care about their wives? Don't men care about safety? And so the notion that some news directors may have, who are generally men again, that we only will use this platform to speak to white men, the notion that you then are saying that those white men have a narrow point of view of what they should know and what they should care about. Moreover, are you saying that those white men in your audience don't care about everyone else? And moreover, I'll go deeper because we have to, that I always go back to this public license, and that as a journalist, I'm supposed to help you make sense of it all and give you some greater depth of understanding. And so just because you tell me, as I have been told, our audience is white men, well, the issues affecting our community at large are not just issues of what a singular white man would face in his kitchen. It's broader than that, and it is deeper than that. And we should be explaining to our audience, I want to elevate the conversation.
Sure.
I always want to elevate the conversation and deepen the understanding. And so I know it is a product, and I know we have to have ratings, and we have to sell, and we have to have advertisers. But I have a responsibility that goes beyond just speaking to a singular group of people.
You know, what's interesting to me is that we're seeing this happen in network television, for example. The audience for network television goes down by about 10% every year, right? As people go to streaming, first they were going to cable and then they go to streaming, people are finding all these different ways to find entertainment. Fewer of them are watching broadcast television. But guess who is a loyal viewer of broadcast television? Black folks, especially Black women, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as that audience starts to go down, they start to realize, hey, there's this whole audience that we've taken for granted for decades that now we really need. And so all of a sudden, if you wondered why, shows like How to Get Away with Murder or Scandal or Empire got so much support from network television, it was because they realized they needed shows that would appeal to Black people, especially Black women, in order to secure this group that was still watching broadcast television. And so that's the argument that I use when I go to local television and when I go to newspapers to say, here's an audience you haven't even tried to appeal to, right? Here's an audience you haven't even tried to cultivate. And it's an audience that has a lot of members in it who are still kind of old school media consumers. They still watch daytime television. They'll read a printed product if there's something in it that actually speaks to them. And so, we've been making the case in a lot of different venues that newspapers need to start reaching out to communities of color and offering them the kind of coverage they've never had before to try and get them to buy the newspaper. And then once you develop that audience, you can sell that audience to advertisers. Who makes the purchasing decisions in Black homes? Black women do. There's a reason why Oprah Winfrey, when her Oprah Winfrey Network cable channel was having trouble, they pivoted to target Black women, right? Because that was her most loyal constituency, and they're the most powerful commercial force inside Black households. They're the ones who choose what gets bought for groceries, what gets bought for cleaning products, what kind of clothes get bought. They make those decisions. So I think, media outlets, news outlets have had to learn a whole new game, and they're being forced to because their traditional audiences are fleeing, and they have to find new audiences. And so that's the argument I'm always making.
Both of you all are involved in your local as well as the National Association of Black Journalists. Why do you think that what's that representation and membership like in terms of actually working as journalists in the field? And what are those numbers like? And could you speak some to that?
Is your question just how many members there are of the National Association of Black Journalists, or?
Yeah, my guess is that you probably have more members than actually journalists that we see or read from in papers or on air. And I guess I'm trying to understand maybe that imbalance there.
Membership in the National Association of Black Journalists, it's like the NAACP. Anybody can join. The National Association of Black Journalists, the name denotes what we are focused on, which is helping Black journalists do better in the industry and also helping the industry better cover Black people. But anybody who cares about that cause can join. So NABJ has a lot of members who are white and are not Black. And we also have some members who are marketing professionals, or they're in advertising. They're not necessarily journalists, but most of NABJ's members are journalists, and I would hazard a guess that most of our membership are Black journalists. And I will say that I've been a journalist for 30 years this May, and every significant job I've had has come in some way through a contact with NABJ, or through a discussion I had at a conference, or through a friendship that I made through the National Association of Black Journalists. So I think the group is a really important networking source. It presents the largest journalism convention, period, in the world. Whether you're talking about minority-centered or mainstream journalism organizations. Our last virtual conference had over 3,000 people participate, and the year before that in Miami we had about 3,000 people come in person. So it's a potent group. It has its faults, as I'm
every
sure,
group does. Yeah.
Carol could attest to too. We all have our gripes with the way NABJ does some things, but overall, I think the group has had a really positive impact, and it's just like if you're a person of color and there's only 2 or 3 of you in a newsroom, to go to a convention where there's so many more people who are going through what you're going through, or what I'll say is in Tampa, for example, a lot of the local TV stations may employ 1 or 2 or 3 people of color in each station. So the ABC affiliate has 2 or 3, the CBS affiliate has 2 or 3. At the NABJ local chapter meetings, that's where all those people can meet each other, and they can talk about, well, what's it like in your shop, or how are they treating you, when you have to go do a stand-up, or who gets the best assignments, in your news shop, and people can compare notes, they can come up with strategies together, and they have a sense that they're not alone. Which you can wind up feeling that way, right, if you're in a newsroom where there's only a few Black people.
And that has been my greatest joy and greatest heartbreak, I think, is coming together with other journalists and other storytellers and those who are in public relations to get an understanding of what they are going through, and to hold each other up. And it is my greatest joy because, that's why we're all on this planet, is to encourage each other, of course, in my belief, but greatest heartbreak in that, we always check the calendar. What year is it? And are we still going through what we are going through? Is that photog still why is he getting the worst equipment? Why is he not getting the help he's supposed to be getting? Why was she not given that opportunity to anchor? Why was she replaced? Why did that happen in check the calendar, fill in the blank, that particular year? And so that's why it's been the greatest heartbreak. But, whatever the numbers are, whatever membership numbers are, I like to tell people membership has its privileges, but I am at a place in my life, and I have said this publicly, where after you go through as a woman, after you go through menopause and you reach a certain age and stage in life, that it's now my job and my duty and my joy and my responsibility to kick some doors in. I've never had to kick a door in, but there are young journalists in the market in every market, who do not want to ruffle feathers, but they know that they're not being treated correctly, appropriately. And hopefully they have somebody like Eric and somebody like me who's been around long enough, and we've got enough cachet that we can go in and say, what is going on? So whatever the membership numbers are, somebody may not be a member. I mean, somebody that I'm helping right now, she said she's joining today. She had not been a member, but I'm there for her in giving her advice in the issues that she is dealing with in her shop.
The importance.
Yeah, and you know what I'm loving about this moment too is that I feel like in some ways the younger folks are pulling us old heads
Yeah.
along, because at NPR I can tell you that the younger employees are not willing to tolerate the kind of stuff that we put up with when we were starting out, and we just sort of figure, well, that's how the game works,
Yeah.
that's, you can't rock the boat too much, and then they come in and they're like, what? we're not
I don't
doing
think
it,
so.
I mean, what's amazing to me, so I think NPR, if you look at our whole newsroom, we're at like 26% non-white, right? Now I have worked in newspapers for most of my career, something like 22 years. I have never worked at a newspaper that was even close to that level of diversity. It was much more like 13, 14, 15%, right? So I'm happy. I'm walking around and we have, we have, even in the arts desk, which is relatively small, I'm not the only non-white person. We have an Asian person, we have a person of Arab descent, we have a Latino. I'm not the only person of color, even though we have a really small, department. But the young people are not putting up with it. They're not happy with it. They're like, hey, the national percentage is 36%. So we need to get there. And in particular, we don't have enough Latinx employees. So folks are pushing for that. And I'm like, hey, I'm right behind you, but you lead the charge, because you have pointed it out, and you feel you're pulling us to be better. And so I feel like the younger people in a lot of ways are pulling those of us who have been in the trenches for a while and saying, hey, the next mountaintop is right in front of us, and we got to pull for it.
It reminds me of our first conversation on Webster Speaks with Dr. Donald Suggs, and he spoke to the youth really leading today's movement, period, all across, right? Even the social justice work, hearing you all speak in terms of even in the newsrooms, right? It is definitely the youth that are motivating us to be different and better, and really are taking the charge. And I think at this point, it's one of those necessary steps for us. We've had an opportunity, right? Is to in some ways step aside and let them go with some of that new fire that they have. I'd like to at this time invite our viewers to tweet questions to Eric and Carol at #WebsterSpeaks. And we will take your questions from there. I'll ask Earl if he might at this point have any questions from any of our earlier tweets.
Yes, we have a couple of great ones, shall I say. This one goes, how does the media villainize victims when there are people of color, but humanize a Caucasian predator that's guilty of the most heinous crimes? What can be done to hold journalists/reporters responsible for this behavior/conduct?
I would say that not even is the action taken against suspects, but the action is used for victims. And I will never forget a story some years ago where a young woman from the St. Louis area was in college in another state and was raped and murdered. And as a white female victim, the media continue to portray that she is the daughter of a doctor. And I finally asked a coworker, I need you to explain to me the relevance of her father's profession. And so we see that time and time again, where not just our Black suspects, their mugshots are used, but the high school graduation photo of a white suspect may be used, or no mugshot at all for white suspects. We also see the beautification of white victims. We know their whole story and the house this beautiful house they lived in, and what she did for a living or he did for a living. And we don't necessarily know that when it comes to even Black victims. So to that person who's asking that question, I would say it happens on all different levels, not just about Black suspects, but about white victims are held up in a different way than Black victims are. We don't even often know the story of Black victims, their lives, who they were. And the way to make this, again, let's go back to the very first issue. That is diversity. That is diversity. There has to be a diverse newsroom that can raise these questions. I over the course of my career, over 30 years, I have often felt like I know what they think when they see me coming, because I have something to say. I have something to say about it all. I want to ask you, you have to think about what you just put in front of me on the screen, what you just wrote. And so that has to happen. And it can't just be the Black anchor or the Black reporter in that newsroom. I would call on all people of good character to ask these questions before you put things out there.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is that the NABJ chapters are a good way to police this kind of stuff. I just helped the president of an NABJ chapter in the Midwest compose a letter, a press release really, where she called out one of the local print outlets for unfairly, that unfair imbalance. I'm forgetting exactly what it was. I think it was like the use of mugshots or something like that. But Black people were being portrayed much more harshly than white people were. And in fact, once she put out the press release and reached out to the media outlet to inform them that they were going to be speaking about this, she got into a dialogue with the editor, and the editor realized that he had made a mistake, apologized, and corrected the stories that were being complained about. So I think part of what can happen is that NABJ chapters and employees, Black employees, can kind of step up and say, hey, what's going on here? The other thing that we're trying to do is break down these cycles that happen in media coverage that tend to uplift white victims or white perpetrators and downgrade Black victims and Black perpetrators. So when you look at Trayvon Martin, for example, the young Black man who was killed in Florida while he was walking to his father's girlfriend's home by George Zimmerman. In that case, it took probably a good week and a half, maybe even 2 weeks, for that to become a national story. And then when it became a national story, it took about 44 days after the murder for George Zimmerman to be arrested and charged officially. Now we're seeing, at the very least, that when these incidents happen, they are getting a level of coverage, of national coverage, right away. We're jumping on these stories and we're making sure people know about them. So in the Ahmaud Arbery case, you're not waiting a month and a half for those guys to get charged. It still took too long, but at the very least, it was a national story pretty soon after it happened, and that increased the public pressure to make law enforcement and the criminal justice system react the way they were supposed to. The other thing we're doing is keeping an eye on how Black victims get treated, because what happens is one of these things happens, someone gets killed, and then there's the stories where they dig into the victim's past. Mm-hmm. And Black folks are often subjected to a level of scrutiny where, did they smoke weed in high school? Do they have, assault charges in their background, even though it may not have had anything to do with the incident in which they were actually killed. And so the other thing we're trying to do is keep an eye on that and say to journalists, is this really germane? Mm-hmm. Are you really presenting an accurate picture of this person? And are you trying to affect the public perception of that person so that law enforcement can more easily ignore pursuing their killers? So there's a lot of elements to this, and I feel like we've gotten better at bird dogging them and getting on the stories quicker and criticizing people when they do this other kind of coverage that doesn't help things. But it still happens, and we still have to be vigilant.
I'm glad to hear that there's work on that, because that truly does irk me, right? When I think of the victims who are Black and the ways in which we dehumanize them so quickly. I often, it really bothers me. But then additionally, I can watch the news and I generally can tell if a crime was committed by a white person because there's no gray, right? There's no mention of race. And in my head, that then just says that that's someone who is white. And sure enough, as the story goes and develops, it's a white person. Black people, it seems as if, or people of color, Black and brown folks, immediately there's this photo with them in the story. And these, again, are just suspects, right? But we have convicted, tried them all through the media immediately. So
I'm sure Carol can sympathize with this. But when I started at newspapers in 1990, it was routine that if a Black person was involved in a crime or a Latino person, their race was mentioned, and if it was a white person, it was not. And that was more a sense of, well, we know who our audience is, and so we're just going to describe the race of the people that are not our audience. like the newspaper had this idea of who is us and who is them, and so when them were involved in a crime, we'll tell you their race. But if it's us, well, then it's us, so we don't have to tell you. And so, one of the first things I had to do as somebody who was involved with the NABJ in a local capacity was challenge the newspapers to only mention race when it was germane to the crime, and stop listing the race of all these people who were suspected of crimes or arrested of crimes if their race didn't have anything to do with the actual issue. And so that's the kind of fight that we've been fighting, for decades.
Well, thank you for the fight.
To that, I wanted to add to that two things also need to happen, and that is that journalists have to address their exhaustion, because the challenges that are happening in newsrooms by those people who are brave enough, whether it is young people or the old heads, who are challenging their editors, challenging their news directors, there's a level of exhaustion that is being felt around the country. And so we have to address that. And self-care is a very real issue. And the second thing is we are educators as well. And so that is a conversation that I've been having all the years of my career, that when a suspect is made known to the newsroom, if all you know is the ethnicity of that person, that is not enough of a description to put on the air. If all you have is Black man, blue jean jacket, that is not enough of a description. We need height and weight and hair and shoe. We need a description. The race or ethnicity of that person is not a description. And so and if you hear it, for those who are watching this, if you hear it, call that media outlet, call them out on it, because you're not helping the public. The idea of a description of a suspect is to help the public, to help the police to find that person. If you simply say Black man in a check shirt, that's not going to help the public at all, and it further indicts all Black men. Mm-hmm. So call outlets, call them out. Please call them out.
And in fact, often those racial descriptors are wrong. They will say someone is Black, but the witness might be wrong. That person might be from the Caribbean, or might be Afro-Cuban, or might be Mexican, a very dark-skinned Mexican. And all of a sudden people are looking at African Americans and they're completely missing who the suspect might actually be. George Zimmerman, when he was first identified by police who had interviewed him after he shot and killed Trayvon Martin, they said that he was white in their report, but he wasn't. He was Hispanic. So that set off like a week and a half of incorrect reporting about the racial elements of the crime, because they assumed it was a white man who had killed a Black man or a Black boy, and the racial dynamic was subtler than that. So those kind of descriptions, they're often wrong, and they're based on people's sort of split second identification of someone's ethnicity. That might not even be right, and that's why I've often recommended you can't just say Black, It's better to say, what color was the person's skin? If you've seen them and you can actually describe it, it's much better to say, what was their skin tone like? What were their facial features like? Try to get some specific information as opposed to some generalized racial descriptor that might be incorrect.
I smile only just thinking, we think in terms of the spectrum of the hues of our color as people of color. And I wonder how well and how comfortable our white colleagues and friends and neighbors are being able to articulate and being able to define that. I think that would be a great way to better inform the public and the police, but I wonder how well that could actually be done. Earl, do we have another question out there?
Yes, we do. And this question states, is on topic actually as well. What media outlets are doing it right? Who should we be listening to, reading, watching, in an effort to support their voices?
I wonder if the person who's asking that question, if they are talking about news, are they talking about talk? Are they talking about talking heads? Are they talking about analysts? Because they're all different, right? But what I would say is a little bit of everything. I would absolutely encourage you to watch, read, and listen to a little bit of everything. Now, that being said, there are some outlets out there, national outlets, that definitely have a point of view. And so I would take all of that with a grain of salt. I would say what not to do. Please, 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 please stop getting your news from Facebook. I have said on my Facebook page, if you see something, you can ask me and let's figure out the source, because there are a lot of outlets out there that are just made up. They're clickbait. It's not real. It's not true. And so I would say, stop getting your news from Facebook and watch a little bit of everything, and be certain that what you are watching might be talking heads, but it's not a newscast. So be clear of what the difference is, because there is a clear difference. Analysis is not news. Analysis is simply analysis.
Yeah. And what I often tell people, when people say the media, often what they mean is television, and often what they mean is cable TV news. Like, that's how people define the media. But I would say, especially now, it's important to moderate your consumption of cable TV news, because cable TV news in particular galvanizes audiences and finds success through conflict. That's how they keep you watching. It's constantly about presenting alarming situations and combative situations to make you keep watching, because their goal is to not have you just check in and find out what the headlines are and then go about your day. They want you to stay tuned in to CNN or Fox News or MSNBC. And so it can agitate you over the course of a day. If you keep that on in the background while you're working at home, you get this steady stream of provocation and alarmist reporting that can really set you on edge without you even realizing. So my first recommendation is to moderate your cable TV news intake. I would say that if you're interested in outlets that handle racial issues well, I love our podcast and our online platform called Code Switch. It's a really well done podcast, and we also have radio reporters, and we have people who write for our website. We're constantly looking at difference and culture in a lot of different ways, and particularly since the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and all the folks that we've been talking about who died in the last few months, Black folks who've been killed by police. They've really risen to the challenge and done a great job of presenting episodes that are really informative. So I love them. I love The Undefeated, which is a website that's part of the ESPN family, but it's focused on people of color. And it's not just about athleticism and sports, although it's strongly connected to that. They talk about people of color all the time in innovative and interesting ways. I even love this website called Very Smart Brothers. If you're hip to that platform, there's a lot of great commentary there about issues that affect people of color, and it's a lot of it is grounded in pop culture and in entertainment and things that we think of as fun, but also talking very seriously about the issues affecting us. And then finally, I'll put in a plug for public media, because as much as public media has struggled sometimes with diversity, particularly in its local stations, I do think NPR does a pretty good job of trying to cover diversity and difference. And we're constantly re-examining how we do it and trying to find new ways to do it. And I've seen great work at WNYC. I've seen great work at the St. Louis affiliate. I've seen great work at WAMU in Washington, D.C., and in other outlets. So I'm going to put in a plug for public media and PBS and the NewsHour. I think they do a good job with it too. So there's a lot of different places to find this coverage, but I agree with Carol. You can't take anything for granted. And no matter what news source you go to, you can't fully trust it. You always have to interrogate what they're telling you and be a little skeptical when you see the reporting, especially if they're reporting something that no one else is reporting, because it's always possible for even a good news outlet to get the story wrong. Oh, and one more plug, the New York Times Magazine, which did a great job with the 1619 Project. And I feel like the magazine has always been a little more on top of covering diversity than the actual newspaper. So,
thank you. Earl, I understand we have a special question out there, possibly for Carol.
Yes, we do. We have it from a Roberta Woods.
Wait a minute. Go ahead. I'll tell you the story.
She says, "Hey, Carol, it's one of your college roommates, Roberta. Thank you for using your voice to speak your truth. As an educator, what suggestions will you give teachers that will help them educate students on how to discern what they see on television?"
Oh, that is so good. That is so good. Teachers are, and Roberta and I were college roommates at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Teachers are beleaguered already, but sadly, I know Roberta can speak to this, that far too many are not even delving into the issues of equity and race, and may not even want to. And so if this is for those who do want to, I would start with this book by our panelists. There are a lot of books out there, and I believe that there are a lot of people out there who are willing to come on to Zoom with teachers, with educators around the country. And I would say to educators, do not be bold. Be bold. Do not be afraid to try to reach out to someone you think is doing it well, someone who's written a book, someone who's written a magazine article, so all those that Eric just mentioned. Don't be afraid to reach out to them and invite them into your classroom. We complain about Zoom, but it's opened up a whole new world for us in terms of conversation. Now, we're not on Zoom now, but that's what you can do as an educator, to bring those people into your classroom. I would say to educators to do some research about the history of your own community, where you live, to try to find those newsmakers, those history makers in the community where you live, and try to bring them into the conversation with your students. Young people are so savvy today. They're even a little jaded today. And so they don't want the same old books and the same old lesson plan. So you can be creative, more creative than you've ever been, to just flip this whole thing over and bring in the people who were on the front lines, and have them talk to your class, because young people today know, when you may be trying to pull a fast one over them, or they also know when we are being lazy with them. So if they can reach out on Twitter and get the founder of XYZ, you as an educator can do the same. So if you love a certain book and it has spoken to you, try to get that author to come in. Look into your own community and find those history makers, and try to have them in as guests to be the witnesses for your students that they really need to hear from today. So I hope that helped, Roberta.
Yeah,
she ran track. She was awesome.
At the risk of self-promoting, one of the reasons why I wrote Race Baiter was because I've been an adjunct at the University of Tampa and an adjunct at Eckerd College here in Florida, and I was trying to teach the stuff about how race and media works and how the media covers race and things like that. And I would have to ask my students to, mimeograph or make a copy of this magazine article and, click on this link. And, I was cobbling together all these different things for classes because there wasn't one book that had all that stuff in one place. And so, when I was trying to decide what I was going to do in terms of writing a book, I decided to put it all in one place. So at the very least, you had a book that talks about, the effect of having MSNBC on the left and Fox News on the right competing against each other and what that does to people's trust in journalism in general. I talked about the history of Black folks and how they've been depicted on television. I talked about how political media was affected by, having to cover Barack Obama and cover a serious Black candidate for the presidency. All these different things, how poverty and why poverty is undercovered by our news media and what effect that has on our poverty programs and why it's so hard to get people to address poverty through legislation these days. All this kind of stuff, I just pulled it all together in one book. So that's one thing. And I agree with Carol. When I was teaching at Duke, I found a couple of journalists that I really admired, Soledad O'Brien and Jelani Cobb, and just asked them to Skype in and talk to my kids, and they did. And people have asked me, if they like the book, they'll ask me to Skype in, and if I can, I will. So there are people out there who are willing to provide you some extra material. And the Poynter Institute is actually there's an organization called the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. It's based here in Florida, and it's funded by the Tampa Bay Times. And if you go to poynter.org, you will see a lot of teaching tools there. Some of them are for mid-career journalists, but some of them are also for teachers. I spoke at an event called Teachapalooza, where we had teachers from all over the country hearing from people who teach journalism and media, give them ideas on how to use these things in their class. So I would say go to poynter.org and look through some of the materials that are available there for teachers. And that'll also give you some context for people who could maybe come and talk to your class or could talk to you about what might be available.
And it's Poynter, P-O-Y, correct?
Poynter.org is the website.
Okay. Eric, can you explain what was behind the origin behind this title here?
I think you already know that, but thank you for setting me up. So this book got its name from my good friend Bill O'Reilly, who used to be the biggest star at Fox News Channel. The centerpiece of the book, in a lot of ways, is my look. I mean, this book came out in 2012, so the centerpiece of the book was an in-depth look at how Fox News demonizes Black people and uses them to galvanize an audience and hold on to an audience. And so, of course, I wanted to talk to Bill O'Reilly about how he talks about race because he was their biggest star at the time. And I think I had, I'm not quite sure what prompted this, but I think I had written a column about, he used to have a radio show in addition to the TV show that he had on Fox News. And on this radio show, he talked about going with Al Sharpton to Sylvia's restaurant in Harlem, the renowned African-American owned restaurant in Harlem. And he was surprised, he said this on the radio, that he was surprised that there weren't people walking around saying, I want more iced tea, MFer, and that people were so genteel and they were so, they were just like everybody else. And he couldn't believe it. And so I wrote this column where I was just like, I can't believe that you're that dense. It's basically what I said. But I think that's what he was reacting to. I'm not sure. But he did one of his talking points memo commentaries, which used to start his show. And he talked about how white people can't talk to Black people about race anymore because one slip of the tongue lands you in big trouble. And then he said the biggest race baiter in the country was Eric Deggans, who at the time was writing for the St. Petersburg Times newspaper. I didn't even know he was going to do this. The way I found out about it was I started getting all these emails from his viewers, and I thought to myself, that's not exactly ethical journalism. If you're going to do a column where you're severely criticizing somebody, you think you would at least call them. When I was writing my book, severely criticizing him, I called Fox News several times to try and get him to comment, but he wouldn't. And I used to tell this story at parties and with friends, and I was at a neighborhood get together, and a really good friend of mine who's also a writer said, that guy tried to silence you by calling you a race baiter. And that's not what the term means. That's not what the term was originally created to describe, but he tried to weaponize it to silence you. And so you should call your book Race Baiter. And you should say, if being a race baiter means standing up to people like Bill O'Reilly, then call me a race baiter. And I was like, you know what, you're right. And so that's what I did.
You've made it. You've made it.
Well, I love pointing out that I have a job and he doesn't. So I think, what is that? The arc of history bends towards justice.
Yeah, for sure. Our time has gone by really quickly. This is a conversation that could certainly continue, and I'm sorry that it has come to an end as quickly as it has gone by. I want to thank, before I call up Chancellor Strobel, as we do and end each show with her words, I'd like to again thank the two of you, Eric and Carol, for your time, your insight, and your perspective, and certainly for your voice, and utilizing your voice in the representation of people who look like me, and making sure that we are fairly presented and accurately portrayed, and for your advocacy you are doing in the newsrooms, and making sure that our stories get properly told. Thank you for that. I'd also like to thank those members in our audience who have joined us tonight and who continue to support all of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work at the university. Greatly appreciated. It is because of your support, in part, that we are able to do many of the initiatives that we do proudly at the university. I'd like to now call up Chancellor Beth Strobel to say a few words to us.
All right. Well, good evening, and wow, what a dynamic hour we have just spent. Fabulous, fabulous. So thank you, Vincent. Thank you for Earl for yet another powerhouse evening on these topics that we know we need to pay attention to. And Eric and Carol, the generosity of your wisdom and your insight and your experience and your passion for leadership. I want to join you in saying it's important for all of us to be bold. We need the passion of youth. We need the wisdom and leadership of experience. And that combination together is what will make this get better. And I agree with you, Carol. It's hard to imagine that we're still fighting the fight that we are on so many fronts, but it's really, really important. So I really want to just reflect a bit on what I took notes on, because this was such a rich and amazing conversation. Point of view matters. There's power in point of view. And I agree with you that accuracy comes from our commitment to diversity and inclusion, because it makes our team stronger, whether we're in a journalism team or whether we're in a university team or whatever the team is. For the sake of accuracy and getting the point of views to strengthen each other in service of the team and in service to our mission, to the broader community, it can't be done without an inclusive viewpoint. It's just impossible. And I think about the power each one of us has in our words and images, and how important it is as consumers, which we all are, and as communicators, to have a rich appreciation for the power of what we choose to say and illustrate and what we choose not to. And if our perspective is limited and limiting, Carol, thinking about, thinking that we know the audience and just reinforcing what we think that audience needs or wants or is interested in. As educators, we can't do that. As educators, we do have to elevate, to enlarge, to humanize, to expand. And that's our role. And I am so grateful you joined us tonight, because certainly whether we're speaking to our community tonight or whether we're speaking to our own internal university community, your insight and your experience and your very specific pieces of advice, the examples, the power of your examples helps us try to build more aspirations for an even greater diversity of young people to be the storytellers that we need them to be. We need to build their aspirations, help them hone their craft, help them tell the stories that have been untold in only the ways they can. And so I really want to thank both of you for taking on the role of educator in the ways that you have and that you continue to. I love your advice about teachers being so bold as to invite you in and to invite others in, because that is the power of the virtual community that we're now all part of. We always were, but now it's so real and tangible for us. And you've shown tonight how much we can learn in an hour to help us want to learn more. So I just want to end my comments by thanking you for your generosity. Thank you for your service, for your commitment. And you have fueled in us the desire to learn more and to be more. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a fan, Dr. Strobel. I am a fan. I have been a longtime fan of your leadership. You know that for many, many years now. And I'm so grateful to be a part of the Webster community now as well. And so thank you so much for having this ongoing conversation, Vincent and Earl. I certainly appreciate your efforts and your work tonight. And Eric, it has been a joy and an honor to be on the same platform with you this evening.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad you guys invited me. This was a wonderful experience. And I hope whatever I had to say was helpful.
Thanks to you. I encourage you all to join us on our next episode of Webster Speaks, September 2nd, and we will feature Olympic gold medalist Jackie Joyner-Kersee, who will discuss to us the power of the Black athlete and the voice that they are utilizing today on and off the court and fields. So please join us then. Again, thank you all. Have a great week, and good night.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.